I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very grateful to be able to share my thoughts about how do you build an energy democracy movement. I was a little skeptical at first when Al invited me, and especially since we were moving the agenda around a little and just wanted, Nikki to go first and me to talk about this movement thing, and I just realized that, okay, this guy is obviously recognizing my senior citizen status. Because he knows, been there, done that. I am proud to say I'm a child of the 60s, right? So I'm a movement child, right? At least the U.S. movement child, right? And I was a part of the civil rights movement down in the South, all right, where, got the tear gas and faced down the paramilitary forces and, all right, burned a building or car here or there and chased down the streets by some rednecks who toting guns at us and calling us racial slurs. So, was a part of that civil rights movement. Also a part of the Black Power movement. Basically, because I was, at that time, young enough and old enough to just be mad as hell. And just not taking it anymore. And what's up with this nonviolence thing? And, everything that happened to me was all violent, so definitely joined that until they scared the shit out of me. What was going on there? But then also a part of the peace movement, I still have my buttons, make war, make peace, not war. And so if I hadn't lived it, I was totally peripheral to it, okay, because I was peripheral to the women's movement, but strongly engaged in the abortion rights movement. I was squarely there, having seen and actually experienced some of what happens when there isn't the abortion rights and what women had to do to their bodies to make their own choices. Was a part of the environmental justice movement, and in fact, the first, I think, African-American woman of color movement to dismantle the incinerator project that was slated for South Los Angeles, the Lancer project. And so I guess, I know a little bit about movement, and if I haven't been there, if I hadn't looked at it on the outside, I'm also a history buff. And I love biographies. And I have read about a lot of the movements of the past. So I guess age has its value. I don't know where Al is. And so I'm going to really share a little bit about, what I learned from those heady times, because it was really worth it. And it allows us to share about how we build an energy democracy movement. And from these movements, there's a couple of important things I want to share. None of these movements, as important as they were, compare to what I think you're talking about today, the energy democracy movement, from the frame that you spoke of it this morning. The movement goals and the challenges that we are talking about today are the challenges that only has one precedent. Does anybody know what that precedent is? Right? So if the goal of the energy democracy movement is to dismantle the fossil fuel economy, right, that relies to build a movement that relies on renewable sources and to channel and change ownership and control of clean energy sources, then the only precedent that comes to mind is the movement to dismantle the slave economy, right? The abolitionist movement. And paradoxically, the only progressive anti-immigration movement that we've ever seen, which is to stop the slave trade, stop importing African people into America in chains. So as opposed to these human rights movements that I've been a part of, right, the rights of women, the rights of African Americans and other immigrants, and the rights to peace, all right, these movements don't compare to the abolitionist movement and the energy democracy movement, because those two movements challenge the very core, the very foundation of the global economy. It doesn't chip away at its pillars, right, in the way that these other movements did. It actually seeks to remove those pillars, right? And there are a lot of parallels that we can see, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. The key two parallels is that what we're talking about when we talk about changing and building an energy democracy movement, as we did the freedom movement, the abolitionist movement, is that we're looking at changing the means of production, right? And we're also talking about changing our way of life. When we talk about changing the means of production, we're talking about the structures of work and wealth accumulation. Our U.S. global economy was powered by free labor under slavery for 350 years. The fossil fuel took the place of slaves and has been the source of the U.S. global economy for the past 200 years. Folks, we've only known two types of economy in the U.S.'s history, and that's been the slave economy and then the fossil fuel economy. So it has powered, these two economies have powered every aspect of our economy, our manufacturing system, our distribution and our retail system, from food to housing to transportation. It is rooted in how we know the world, right? It's also, when we talk about the means of production, really talking about property rights and dismantling people's quote-unquote constitutional rights to property. Under slavery, slaves were property. And people had rights to exploit, to use, extract, this property to drive their economic wealth and their well-being. The same way, we have natural resources in our property, and Cecilia talked about it, the commodification of property. It is embedded in our Constitution, right? So when we start thinking about, an energy democracy movement, we have to really think very deeply about what it is that we're talking about. The slave economy and the fossil fuel economy was very clear about addressing issues of global trade policies, right? The slave trade. And today, it's the free trade policies that we're seeing. And we raised the book, Naomi Klein talks about it in her book, about how we're putting these policies together that are forcing us to lose our sovereignty, our local sovereignty to own and determine whether or not somebody can frack in my backyard. They're now suing local communities because it's violating free trade so that they can't come into your backyard, frack and extract that gas to export to other places for their benefit. So we've got, again, this notion of a new economy rooted in trade policies. It is really about the distribution of power and wealth. Under the slave economy, it was, shifting the power from the South to the North. And for us, it's about shifting powers from multinational corporations to communities. So it's really about the means of production, but it's also about the way we live and our way of life. In the sense that these movements fundamentally change how we live. Okay, so I'm sorry, I ain't cooking for y'all no more. Okay, I'm not cleaning for y'all no more. I mean, the benefits of slavery accrued to everyone, whether you own slaves or not. They accrued to everyone in the society. It's how they understood the world as being normative. That's the way we should live. The same way that our way of life must fundamentally change when we think about changing the fossil fuel economy. Cecilia talked about in terms of the gigatons or whatever the capacity is. How do we go from 17 point, what's the number? Yeah, well, we have to move from 3.5 tons to, from 17 point whatever tons to 3 point. How is that individually going to impact us? And are we really willing, ready, and able to make those personal sacrifices, right? Just as we had to give up our slaves, right, on the people that didn't have them but still benefited from them, are we willing to make that sacrifice to our way of life? And so the sense of the truth and strategy is that these beliefs, these are entrenched beliefs about, how we should be and what was normative. And it was fortified. The beliefs that this is the right economy, was fortified by structures that held it up. Religion, which was used and ordained that, slave economy, for example, or even the fossil fuel economy is providence. right? It's been ordained. It's upheld by science. Science was used to validate this economy, all right? That, black folks, Africans are inferior, scientifically proven. Look at the shape of the head, whatever. Or the science deniers in terms of climate change. Education, the educational system was used to institutionalize, all right, these beliefs and to spread it. Laws were used to protect it, and financing was used to grow it. These are the bedrocks, the foundation of what a movement has got to deal with and how you unravel this to create a new, just economy. So if this is the change we seek, then what are the strategies for affecting that change? We have to ask ourselves if this is the change we seek. And there was a conversation that happened in the community solar workshop this morning, which was about, we're still struggling to figure out, is capitalism good? Maybe it's a little bit good. Maybe we have a little bit of it, not a whole lot of it. I mean, we've not really squarely landed on what is the change we seek. And I know we're all here thinking that the movement is about renewables, and a movement about green jobs, a movement for carbon reduction, a movement for better health, a movement for environmental justice. Well, those are different kind of movements. And how we build that movement really depends on where we want, to land, where we want to land. But I think, based on how I know Al and I know others here, that we really want to talk about a moral economy, right? We want to talk about a new kind of economy that just doesn't deal with the environment, but it deals with everything that the extractive economy has done to people, and as Raphael says, and done to our joy. So if the change we seek is not transactional, but it is transformative, then we need to be clear that we have to build a moral economy. It's got to be based on sufficiency. It has to be based on justice. It has to be based on community as opposed to personal enrichment and the accumulation of wealth. So then, given that frame, right, that's a hard job. That's a pretty tough job. Y'all ready? Somebody said earlier, you ready to get on that bus? All right, to get on that bus? All right, that's a job now. Then what are the lessons then that we bring from the abolitionist movements? What will it take? What are the key elements? Just a couple of things, maybe a lot of things, but one is that it's got to come from a lot of different places, right? It's not just everywhere. We have to build partnerships. And we have to build global partners, because this is a global problem, and power and relationships and money is all based on this sort of global fossil fuel economy. We've got to figure out the global partnerships. When we looked at, Frederick Douglass, part of his ability to actually unleash, the abolitionist movement was that he had to go to Europe. He had to go to Europe and to find the folks there that could come to the United States and put the pressure on the United States to effect change. When I even read about Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching movement, she had to go to Europe, all right? And England came here and actually had accountability sessions with folks in the South about, okay, now show me y'all lynching. What y'all been doing down here? And writing it up and making it a global issue. So we've got to find our global partners, and there are many of them. There's, to the extent that we look at the work of the U.S. Alliance, Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, right, led by Ecuador and Bolivia, who are actually changing their constitutions. They changed their constitutions to ensure that nature has a right to survive and to live and to have clean air and clean water. So there are global movements that we have got to make sure that our broader movement connects to. We've got to figure out what the cross-national movements are here, and how do we align our environmental movement with the broader other movements that are taking place. We've got to build to our base. We've got to speak to our base, and we've got to make that base stronger and more vibrant. So it's the environmental community. We've got to make sure that we're engaging communities of color. But how do we connect to the dreamers, right? How do we connect to Black Lives Matter? How do we connect to the Climate Justice Alliance, obviously, ROC, people that are fighting for living wages? How do we connect to the Occupy movement? But since it's so horizontal, we don't know where it is. But how do we make those connections? And part of the ability to make those connections is how do we build sort of the meta-narrative? I heard a little bit about that this morning, this single story question, that the single story doesn't build the bigger tent. We've got to have the bigger tent. And the bigger tent is, and we struggle with that. I'm struggling with this. And if we can come out today with that meta-narrative that speaks to not only the people that we know and that we care about, but also our quote-unquote enemies, right? How do we build a narrative that matters to obviously the religious community and women's community, but to labor? All right, I'm in these conversations. Tara's in these conversations all the time. These are hard conversations when people see their self-interest bedded in and rooted in the way things are right now. All right, how do we have conversations with the utility sector where they see their self-interest in a different kind of world? We're not going to get everybody into this big tent, but is there a moral authority? Is there a moral message, which is what happened in the abolitionist movement, that it just got to people, they just know this shit was wrong. Okay, it was wrong, and they just know there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. How do we get that language in the space so that we can build and find that moral center? That changes our consciousness, that changes the paradigm, that we are a human economy, but it's sustained by a global economic system. There are legal challenges. The abolitionist movement not only had, global connections, not only did it, build partnerships across the world and locally, it also had a moral story, but it also, it fired up the legal challenges in every possible place. We've got legal challenges, too, to the global trade agreements that undermine local sovereignty. We've got to figure out how we actually look at our Constitution. We got slavery out of the Constitution, the rights to slaves. We got that out of the Constitution. What's our constitutional movement? How do we get, land and property as a right out of our Constitution in the way that's being done around the United States? There is no justice as long as nature is property in law. There is no justice as long as nature is property in law. So then there's organizing. These are the elements that we've got to deal with, organizing. And it's interesting that you talked about Selma. And I don't know if anybody saw the movie Selma. Who saw the movie Selma? Okay. Seemed like LA had a pre-screening all over the Christmas holiday. I think I saw it 10 times. But anyway, one of the things that Oprah lifted up, and one of the things that I saw her say, is that one thing that we learned about Selma is that there was strategic intent, right? That it wasn't a willy-nilly, passionate movement, even though it was in many respects. But when you looked at Selma, you saw that it was clear that they were going to go to, what's that crazy cop's name? Bull Connor. They went to Bull Connor specifically because they knew he was a loose cannon. They knew he was a loose cannon. They knew that he was going to blow up and do some stupid stuff. And so they went there to provoke him intentionally. All right, to provoke him so that it became a media attention, brought media attention and galvanized people's emotions. There was strategic. They didn't go to places where folks would just let them, do their nonviolence, but that was a strategic intent. That whether it was Rosa Parks in the later parts of this era, that there was a training ground. There was a place where people learned nonviolence. All right, where I grew up, in fact, it was where down in Nashville, Tennessee, at Fisk University, is where we were trained on nonviolent methods. What's our strategic intent, and how are we going to build an energy movement around that? So, and then finally, I'll say, what's our alternative? We have to build an alternative reality. Right, so and I heard some of that earlier today about changing the goals, setting the example about how it really could be. that this is not theoretical, that actually we can build energy democracies. We can have community grids that, that are powered with values and principles that support families and communities. And then how do we spread these best practices and techniques and make it open and public knowledge? So these are some of the key elements, but I'd love to, talk about how we, organize across the different sectors. But I can also say that while we are trying to tackle this bigger monster, right, but that there are, in fact, as we move towards transformation, that there are transitional strategies. There's transactions, there's transitions, and there's transformations. And that it is okay for us to chip at the pillars, that it is okay to push for green jobs that pay good and fair wages, more than fair wages, that we are pushing for better health in our communities, that we are, demanding that we reduce carbon, and that we build high road platforms to a just economy. So I just want to end by saying that there's a lot to learn from past movements. In fact, I find it instructive and empowering to study the struggles of my ancestors, my elders. And I wonder if I have the fortitude and courage that it took to dismantle the slave economy. What I do know is that more than anything, it took time, it took lives, it took persistence, it took faith, it took courage and determination to never give up. And so these are the qualities that an energy democracy must take. An energy democracy movement must take. And finally, let me say, while dismantling the slave economy was very traumatic, the U.S. and the world didn't fall apart. We almost did, but we didn't. We did have a civil war and a couple of other things. But anyway, but similarly, we will and we can survive a just transition to an energy democracy movement. We have the creativity, we have the resources to build a new moral economy that includes everyone, that places the human economy within the context of our ecosystem. And I look forward to you, because I was telling Nikki, everybody's just talking about how old I am. She said, yeah, my parents, they're over 60 years old, and we got to do it for the black old people. And I'm like, oh, I guess that's me. That's all I got. I'm okay with it, whatever. I look forward to that day. And as I see it, I think the energy democracy movement is really about the unfinished business of past movements. Thank you.